Someone might struggle with something early in life and quietly decide that they just aren't very capable. Maybe they tried something challenging, and the result didn't go the way they hoped. Instead of seeing it as one disappointing attempt, the mind slowly begins to turn that moment into a label. Rather than saying, that didn't work out, the thought gradually becomes, I'm not the kind of person who can do that. This is where the problem begins, because events are temporary, but the identities people build around them often feel permanent. A single failure can become the evidence someone uses to describe themselves for years. A person who had difficulty learning at one point may decide they simply aren't intelligent. Someone who experienced rejection may start to believe they are not worthy of opportunity. A person who went through financial struggles might begin to think they are just the type of person who never gets ahead. The mind has an interesting habit of gathering proof to support whatever story it has already decided to believe. Once someone accepts a certain description of themselves, they start noticing only the things that confirm it. And if the story in their mind says, I'm not capable, then every mistake becomes proof of that belief, while any success gets brushed off as a rare exception. Over time, the story feels stronger and stronger, not because it's accurate, but because the mind keeps feeding it selective evidence. What makes this situation even more unfortunate is that the story often stays in place long after the original circumstances are gone. The person who struggled years ago may have developed new skills, gained valuable experience, and learned a great deal along the way. Yet they still talk about themselves as if they were the same inexperienced person they once were. The description that belonged to an earlier version of themselves quietly becomes the identity they carry forward into the rest of their life. It's important to recognize how powerful this pattern can be. People tend to live in ways that match the way they describe themselves. When someone constantly says, I'm not very responsible, they will often avoid situations that require responsibility without even realizing it. When a person says, I'm not the kind of person who succeeds in business, they may quietly step away from opportunities that could prove the opposite. Over time, that identity starts to act like a set of invisible boundaries. Those limits aren't created by the outside world. They come from the story the person keeps repeating about themselves. Opportunities might appear right in front of them, but they interpret those opportunities through the lens of that old belief. Instead of seeing possibility, they see something that feels unfamiliar. Instead of recognizing progress, they see something that doesn't fit the story they've been telling themselves. Think about how often people describe themselves, using information that belongs to a much earlier time in their lives. Someone might say, I've never been very disciplined, or I've always struggled with confidence, as if those statements describe permanent parts of their character. What often gets overlooked is that the person saying those words is no longer the same person who first formed those conclusions. Life changes people over time. Experiences teach lessons that can't be learned any other way. Exposure to new ideas expands the way someone thinks, and responsibilities slowly strengthen their judgment. Simply living through different situations gradually reshapes a person's abilities and perspective. Yet the description many people carry about themselves stays frozen in a much earlier chapter of their life. This creates a strange situation where someone's present ability is quietly restricted by the conclusions they formed in the past. The evidence that once seemed to support that identity may be years old, but the mind still treats it as if it were current information. As a result, the person's view of themselves becomes based on outdated evidence rather than on who they are today. Imagine a farmer who judged the value of his land based only on what it produced many seasons ago. Perhaps the soil had once been neglected and the harvest was disappointing. If that farmer continued believing the field was permanently unproductive, he might never bother planting new seeds that could change everything. The land itself may have improved over time, but the belief about the land would remain stuck in the past. Something very similar happens in many people's lives. Their skills may have grown, their situation may have improved, and their understanding of the world may have matured. Yet they still talk about themselves based on things that happened long ago. The identity they keep defending is built on evidence that no longer truly represents the person they are today. That's why it can be valuable for someone to occasionally stop and examine the story they're telling about themselves. The real question isn't whether the story was once accurate. The more important question is whether it still describes the person standing here today. When an identity is built on outdated evidence, it can quietly prevent someone from recognizing how much they have already grown. Many people don't realize how much they've actually changed over the years. Instead of looking at what they're capable of today, they measure themselves by old memories. They judge their potential by experiences that happened under completely different circumstances. Without meaning to, they carry forward an outdated version of themselves that belongs to the past rather than the present. The interesting thing is that growth usually happens quietly. Skills develop little by little through practice and repetition. Confidence builds slowly through small wins that accumulate over time. Judgment improves through experience, observation, and reflection. Because these changes happen gradually, they rarely arrive with some dramatic announcement, which is why many people don't fully notice how far they've come. Since the progress feels gradual, the identity someone formed years earlier often goes unquestioned. They continue defending it, explaining it, and living inside its limits, even though it may no longer describe them accurately. In many cases, the person standing here today has already outgrown the description they keep repeating. The real issue is not a lack of ability. The issue is that the identity they're protecting belongs to someone they used to be. As long as that old identity stays in place, the present version of the person has trouble fully stepping forward. Without realizing it, they limit their future by continuing to represent themselves according to their past. Recognizing this can be surprisingly freeing. If the identity someone carries is based on outdated evidence, then it doesn't have the authority they once thought it did. It isn't a permanent definition of who they are. It's simply a story that has been repeated so many times that it started to feel like a permanent truth. Once a person begins to see this clearly, something important can shift. Instead of automatically defending the description that once seemed true, they can start questioning whether it still deserves to guide their choices. They can ask themselves whether the person they've become is actually larger than the identity they've been protecting. That realization often marks the beginning of real personal change. When people understand that their identity might be based on evidence from a much earlier chapter of their life, they gain the freedom to rethink the story they've been telling. And when that story begins to change, new possibilities often appear that had been hidden behind the protection of an outdated version of themselves. This becomes clearer when we look at how identity often presents itself as stability. One of the interesting things about identity is that it often shows up disguised as stability. When someone says, "That's just the way I am," it can sound like they understand themselves really well. It feels steady, consistent, and familiar. But many times that statement isn't actually describing something true about the person. It's describing a story they've grown